Please be seated. Professor Donald and Mrs. Donald, Mr. Chief Justice, Ms. Rehnquist, Chief Justice Berger, I understand, is here. Secretary Cheney and the Honorable Lynn Cheney, distinguished members of the Congress, General Powell, let me welcome you to the White House, and Barbara and I are very pleased to have you here. It's a privilege. We're proud to host this lecture on the presidency of the United States. And this is the first in a series of lectures on the men who have held this office. And it seeks to make them come alive. What were they like? How did they live? How was history, the history of America's house, molded by their dreams? To occupy this office is to ask those questions, and certainly to feel a kinship with those who have gone before. For each in his own way sought to do right and thus achieve good, and each felt a sacred trust with every American, and often wondered, I suspect, how they could be worthy of that trust. Perhaps no president had greater doubts, nor more brilliantly resolved them, than the subject of this inaugural lecture, Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. As president, Lincoln abolished slavery, and he saved the Union. Perhaps no leader has been so severely tested before or since. And yet we remember Abe Lincoln not merely for what he did, we revere him for what he was. Lincoln was a strong man, an arm wrestler, a rail splitter, yet also a mix of kindness and humility. He was at once a hard and gentle person, man of grief and yet of humor. For he knew, as he told Secretary of State Seward, that if he did not tell stories, he felt his heart would break. Tonight we have with us a distinguished man who undoubtedly will tell stories. His name is David Donald, the Charles Warren Professor of American History at Harvard University. A native of Mississippi, Mr. Donald graduated from the University of Illinois, where he was a student of the great Lincoln scholar J.D. Randall. He has taught at some of America's greatest universities and has written 8 books about Lincoln and the Civil War, twice receiving the Pulitzer Prize in biography. Moreover, our guest is now working on a new biography of America's 16th president. Earlier, I spoke of kinship. Well, I'm sure David Donald would agree. Any president's kinship with Lincoln is perhaps the most personal of all. So often, Barbara and I go down to the Lincoln bedroom, which then served as Lincoln's cabinet room and office. And on his desk, to the left of the fireplace, is an original copy of the Gettysburg Address, written in his hand, which you will see in the East Room. And on the mantel is a plaque marking an equally noble legacy. Here, the great unifier signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet perhaps nowhere do we learn more about Lincoln, even now, than in a portrait that I talked about last month off the coast of Malta before meeting Chairman Gorbachev. It is, as this one is, by George H.W. and hangs on the wall of my office upstairs. And in it you see the agony and the greatness of a man who nightly fell on his knees to ask the help of God. The painting shows 2 of his generals and an admiral meeting near the end of a war that pitted brother against brother. And outside at that moment, a battle rages, and yet what we see in the distance is a rainbow, symbol of hope, of the passing of the storm. The painting's name, The Peacemakers. And for me, this is a constant reassurance that the cause of peace will triumph, and that ours can be the future that Lincoln gave his life for, a future free of both tyranny and fear. 129 years ago, leaving Springfield to assume the presidency, Lincoln addressed his home people at Great Western Railway Station, and he told them, all the strange checkered past seems to crowd now upon my mind. Even now, the memory of Abraham Lincoln crowds upon our minds. It's a great privilege, then, to introduce a man who has devoted his lifetime to the study of its tragedy and its glory. One of the great scholars of perhaps our greatest president, Professor David Donald. And thank you, sir, for being with us.
Mr. President, Mrs. Bush, Chief Justice Rehnquist, distinguished guests, it is, of course, an immense honor to be here, and I can't tell you how gratified I was when President and Mrs. Bush asked me to give this inaugural lecture. It is, of course, most appropriate that the first lecture on the presidency should be about Abraham Lincoln, a subject that lends itself to an infinite number of very significant subjects. And there could be a talk this afternoon on Lincoln and the crisis of the Union. There could be a talk on Lincoln and emancipation. There could be a talk on Lincoln the politician. There could be a talk on Lincoln and foreign relations, on Lincoln and Reconstruction. All of these are weighty and significant topics, which indeed I do hope that I will address in a book before very long. They are not my subject today. Nor, Mr. President, do I come with a message for you. I have no moral to point. I have no directions to suggest about how you should conduct the presidency or foreign policy or your relations with Congress or a variety of other matters. Indeed, it seems to me that the American people think you don't need instruction on these points. My scope here, my task here, is a much more limited one. Tonight, my muse soars low to the ground. My task is, my hope is, to talk about the Lincolns in the White House and how they lived, what life was like in the White House during the Lincoln years. One of my colleagues in Cambridge told me that, especially since we're being filmed by PBS, I should call it Upstairs, Downstairs in the White House. But that is indeed my theme. A few weeks after Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated president in 1861, an old friend asked him how he liked living in the Executive Mansion, as the White House was generally called in those days. Brooding, Lincoln said he was reminded, he thought he was rather like the reprobate in Springfield who had been tarred and feathered and ridden out of town on a rail. If it wasn't for the honor of it, he said, he'd much rather have walked. That wry, detached attitude was to serve Lincoln well during the next 4 years. Unfortunately, it was not an attitude that his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, could share. When the Lincolns moved into the White House on March 4, 1861, they were less prepared than any previous occupants for the duties and challenges they would have to face. First of all, they were remarkably young. Lincoln, with one exception, was the youngest president elected up until that time. An able Illinois lawyer who had gained a national reputation in his debates with Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln had no administrative experience of any kind. He had never been governor of his state, nor even mayor of his town of Springfield. A profound student of the Constitution and an assiduous reader of the writings of the Founding Fathers, he had remarkably little practical knowledge of the government that they had established. He had served only a single, rather unsuccessful term in Congress back in the 1840s and had not come back to the national capital since that time. Though Lincoln in the 1850s had conducted a considerable political correspondence across the nation when he was helping organize the Republican Party, he had few personal acquaintances and no close friends in the nation's capital. In charge of the country's foreign relations, he had no correspondence abroad and no acquaintance with a ruler of any foreign power. Nearly a decade younger than her husband, Mary Lincoln was equally unprepared to be the wife of a president. The daughter of a well-to-do cotton manufacturer and merchant, she had grown up in comfort in Lexington, Kentucky, and had received the best instruction available at the time, including some instruction in French. But for the past 25 years, Mary Lincoln had lived in the semi-frontier town of Springfield. with only an occasional visit to Kentucky and one unhappy winter in Washington when her husband was in Congress. In a modest frame house on 8th Street in Springfield, she had made a comfortable middle-class home for her husband and their children. Like Lincoln, she had no friends in Washington. It's clear that if the Lincolns had occupied the executive mansion during the most tranquil of times, they would have had many adjustments to make. But in 1861, the circumstances were particularly difficult. The states of the Gulf South had already seceded and formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis at its head. Confederate forces ringed Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, one of the few remaining Union installations still in the South, and they threatened it momentarily. At the same time, the border states of the Union were teetering between secession and loyalty. Lincoln had to face this crisis as the first Republican president elected by his party, who had to bring together discordant groups that had never before worked together. Even while he was trying to face this crisis, he was besieged by demands for office on the part of Republicans who had helped bring him his victory. Besieged by these office seekers, Lincoln said he sometimes felt like a hotel keeper who was asked to rent rooms in one wing of his establishment while he was trying to put out a fire in the other. Mary Lincoln's problems were equally severe. Because she was the wife of a Republican and she ardently and consistently supported her husband's political career and views, the Southern women who dominated Washington's society resolved to snub her. The few New England women in the capital distrusted her because she was Southern born and because eventually 4 of her brothers and 3 of her brothers-in-law enlisted in the Confederate Army. Just imagine, if you could, this would be as though Eleanor Roosevelt had 3 brothers-in-law and 4 brothers who were officers in the German army during World War II. That was a comparable kind of situation. It was easy to see why you would mistrust such a person. Easterners in general were sure that Mary Lincoln was an uncouth frontier woman, doubtless as uneducated as an Indian squaw, maybe smoking a corncob pipe. Anything that she did or failed to do was sure to be scrutinized and criticized very carefully. The Lincolns then must have had many misgivings on that first day in the White House on March 5 as they began to explore the executive mansion. It's not clear that either of them had ever been in the building before. Certainly, ex-President James Buchanan, retiring President Buchanan, gave no preview of the mansion. He just up and left. Initially, the Lincolns were overwhelmed by the size of their new residence with its, as we all know, magnificent 31 rooms, not counting the conservatory, various outbuildings, and stables. Why, the East Room alone was big enough to hide their entire Springfield house. After a quick inspection, Lincoln, who cared almost nothing about his physical surroundings, pronounced the mansion in good shape and was ready to settle down to work. But Mrs. Lincoln came up with a very different verdict. She went from room to room. She found the furniture broken down, the wallpaper peeling, the carpeting worn, the draperies torn, the 11 basement rooms filthy and rat-infested. The whole place had the look of a run-down, third-rate hotel. Both the Lincolns discovered immediately that the executive mansion was not just a house, it was a public building. Indeed, except for the small family dining room off to the left over there now, all the rooms on this first floor were open to all citizens at all hours of the day and indeed during most hours of the night. And anybody who wanted to could just wander in, no permission required. There was a single elderly doorkeeper who was supposed to prevent vandalism. But souvenir hunters wandered around and they were able to steal yard-long swatches of drapes and carpets and to cut out the delicate medallions from the lace curtains. The Lincolns found that on the second floor, too, nearly half the rooms were also public. They were devoted to the business of the chief executive. Here were the offices of the president's secretaries, the cabinet room, and the office of the president himself, which President Bush has so generously just showed Ms. Donald and myself. Except for the solid black walnut table in the cabinet room, the furnishings of this wing of the White House on the second floor were nondescript. The floor was covered with a kind of oilcloth, which made it easier to clean up after spilled or overrunning spittoons. From early morning until dusk, these rooms were thronged with senators, congressmen, applicants for government jobs, candidates for military appointments, foreign dignitaries, and plain citizens who either had favors to ask or who just wanted to see their president. Some brought notes and cards of introduction. Most simply presented themselves and waited for their turn. In the early months of Lincoln's first administration, the line was so often that it extended out of his second floor office, out in through the corridor, down the stairway, all the way down to the first floor, through the corridor here, and out the north portico, with an job applicant on each step, just like birds on a telegraph line. Lincoln found himself, in effect, a prisoner in his own office. Every time he stepped out in the corridor to go to the family quarters in the west wing, above us here, he was besieged by complaints and petitions. Finally, in order to gain a little privacy, he ordered the only structural addition made to the White House during his administration, a partition built through the cabinet room, which allowed him, in effect, to retreat unobserved from his office into the family quarters. Those family quarters, which initially seemed so palatial, proved to be remarkably constricted. There were, in fact, only 6 or 7 rooms upstairs where the Lincolns could enjoy any privacy at all. And parenthetically, there was no third floor at this time. They made the upstairs oval room the family sitting room and library, and here Lincoln often read. The 2 adjoining rooms on the south side were the bedrooms of President and Mrs. Lincoln. Since Lincoln slept badly and often had to be waked in the middle of the night to receive military dispatches, they used separate but connecting bedrooms. Across the wide corridor was the infrequently used room of their oldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln. Robert Todd Lincoln was a student at Harvard College, and like any true Harvard man, he was not going to let it on that he was impressed by his father being president or by the White House or anything else. He rarely came to the White House except on vacations, and usually his room was a guest room. Also on that north side were the rooms of the 2 youngest Lincoln boys, Willie, age 10, and Thomas, always called Tad, who was 8. Though to adults, the executive mansion during the Civil War was necessarily not a happy place. How could the White House be a happy place when war is going on? But these 2 younger Lincoln boys found endless opportunities for adventure and mischief. Now, adults saw the troops stationed on the south grounds of the White House as an ominous reminder of danger. But to Willie and Tad, the members of this bucktail Pennsylvania regiment were playmates who were always around for a race or games. Full of the martial spirit, Willie and Tad took great pleasure in drilling all the neighborhood boys they could round up and showing something of their father's characteristic. They did the drilling. They were the leaders. With 2 special friends who just matched them in age, Bud and Holly Taft, children of a federal judge who lived nearby, they commandeered the roof of the mansion for their fort. And here, with small logs painted to look like cannon, they fired away relentlessly at invisible Confederates across the river there. Intensely patriotic, Willie published a poem in the Washington National Republican about the heroic death of a friend who had fallen in a minor engagement. The president was so pleased with it, and who wouldn't be pleased at a poem by a 10-year-old son? So pleased with it, he carried the poem, a clipping of it, around in his wallet at all times. Tad, on the other hand, 8, was a little less clear about what was going on. Once he created quite a sensation when President Lincoln, solemnly reviewing troops out on Pennsylvania Avenue as the Union troops marched by, suddenly they all broke into laughter, for behind him, Tad had sneaked in and was waving a Confederate flag. Children in the White House were something new for Americans. There'd never been little children in the White House before, and citizens began showering them with presents. The most valued of these were the pets. somebody gave Willie a beautiful little pony to which he was devoted. He rode nearly every day. And being a good-hearted boy, he also allowed Tad to ride, even though the little boy was so small that his legs stuck out on both sides of the saddle. Especially cherished were two small goats that somebody presented them. They were called Nanko and Nanny. And they frisked on the White House grounds and, when they had an opportunity, wrought havoc in the White House gardens. They were not entirely outside animals. Like the public at large, they had the run of the White House. On one occasion, Tad harnessed Nanko up to a chair which served as a sled, and she burst in with him yelling after her into the East Room where Mrs. Lincoln was having a reception. Well, you can imagine the devastation of crinolines as a goat, a chair, and a screaming little boy came whipping into the East Room and, of course, zipped right out again. And it says a lot about Mrs. Lincoln that she never once rebuked the child. On another occasion, Mrs. Lincoln and Tad, who were away from Washington, grew greatly distressed when they heard that Nanny Goat was lost. And the President of the United States, and this was about the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, interrupted his vital work to telegraph them that the goat had been found, peacefully chewing her cud, curled up on the bed in the White House guest room. When Lincoln could, he played with his boys. One day, Julia Taft, the teenage sister of Bud and Holly, heard a great commotion in the upstairs Oval Room, and entering, found the President of the United States, all 6'4" of him, lying on his back on the floor, Willie and Bud holding down his arms, Tad and Holly his legs. "Julie, sit on his stomach," cried Tad, and the President smiled at her grandly. But there were also quiet times. When Lincoln read to the boys, he would let Tad mount on one arm of his big chair and Holly on another, and Willie and Bud perched precariously at his shoulders. But during the first year in office, Lincoln had all too little time for his sons, for he was busy learning his job, and such a difficult job it is, too. The Department of State, for example, sent over a detailed memorandum of the clothing that an American president was expected to wear. Obediently, Lincoln followed directions, though with his ungainly figure and his immense height, his coat always seemed rumpled and his cravat was always askew. His huge hands, enlarged by years of plowing and of splitting rails, were never comfortable in those white gloves that the State Department prescribed. Once, holding up his hands after he put on a new pair of these gloves, he held them out and said, "Look, they look like canvassed hams." Now, in the first days of his administration, Lincoln sought to be orderly and businesslike. For instance, he began by trying to scan and digest all the morning papers that reached the White House. Finding that too time-consuming, he directed his secretaries to prepare a précis, a digest. And then presently, finding he learned nothing from that, he discontinued it too. Though occasionally he glanced at the telegraphic dispatches in one or two papers, he read none of them regularly and never looked at their editorials. There was, he concluded, nothing that the newspaper men could tell him that he did not already know. And I am reminded, if I may, of the difference between another president, Lyndon Johnson, in this very same room, once told me he read 6 newspapers every morning before he went to his desk. Lincoln read none. After the early days of his administration, much of the mail and correspondence that Lincoln received got no closer attention than did the newspapers. To assist the chief executive, the Congress bent over backward and provided him, Mr. President, with a staff. It consisted of 1 secretary. He appointed to this position the German-American John G. Nicolay, a young and energetic and very efficient man, but not even Nicolay could handle all the work. So the president was, in effect, allowed to borrow 2 more clerks from other departments, and these 3 then were the White House staff during the Lincoln years. A principal duty of these 3 young men was to screen the president's mail. Some 200 or 300 letters a day came in. Scores of these were requests for information or applications for jobs. These could be routinely referred to departments, and nothing more was done about them. Dozens of other letters they threw into the wastebasket. Crank letters, threatening letters, letters containing messages from supernatural powers, letters soliciting the president's endorsement of commercial schemes. Every now and then, though, they would rescue one of these to show to Lincoln to amuse him. One of his favorites was the letter from the man who invented a new gun, rifle. It was a double-barreled rifle, which had the remarkable trait that one of the barrels poked off into the left and the other off to the right. He wrote requesting Lincoln's permission to enlist a regiment of cross-eyed men who could man these rifles, and with them he was sure they could sweep both sides of the Potomac at the same time. Most went in the wastebasket, as you can imagine. The rest had to be seen by the president and answered by him. To many of these he replied in his own handwriting, even taking the time to make a careful handwritten copy of his response for the files. Those files, the letters and their answers, were stored away in a primitive filing system in the president's office upstairs, namely a battered upright mahogany desk with pigeonholes over it. They were arranged alphabetically, and Lincoln took a certain perverse pride at the juxtaposition that the alphabetical arrangement sometime made, as for instance, the same pigeonhole contained the letters from Thurlow Weed, the Republican boss of New York State, but also the letters from Fernando Wood, the Democratic boss of New York City, who had threatened to take his city out of the Union. Pointing to them all in one pigeonhole, Lincoln would chuckle, "Ain't they a pair?" Lincoln worked long hours at his desk. Much of his time was taken in receiving the hundreds of candidates, applicants, petitioners, suppliants, and visitors. Most of these he handled very expeditiously, quickly scanning the letters of recommendation they brought, writing notes on the back of them, and sending them on to proper authorities. When there were more delicate matters, subjects that he did not want to discuss at length, controversial matters, he had a wonderful facility of saying this reminded him of one of his celebrated little stories. And he would begin telling it, gradually rising from his desk, taking his guest by the elbow, telling the story as he walked into the door, coming to the punchline just at the door as the visitor left, puzzled as to what exactly had been said and why had it been said at all. Wherever possible, he avoided flatly rejecting an application for help, preferring to tell one of his little stories to suggest the unreasonableness of the request. For instance, when an officer accused of embezzling $40 of government funds appeared before Lincoln to protest that really he should not be punished because he had stolen only $30, Lincoln said he was reminded of an Indianian who got in a quarrel with his neighbor's daughter because he charged that she had behaved immorally and had 3 illegitimate children. "Now," said the girl's father, enraged, "that's a lie and I can prove it, for she has only 2. The man got the message. Lincoln's friends worried that he was confined to his office so much of the time. They urged him to get out and take fresh air and exercise, but the president insisted on seeing everybody who wanted to see him. "They don't want much and they get very little," he said. "I know how I would feel in their place." Remarkably, during Lincoln's first 12 months in office, this systematic lack of system seemed to work. Stories of his patience, his humanity, his accessibility to even the humblest petitioner spread throughout the North. Millions began to refer to him as Father Abraham. For the first time in American history, common people in the United States began to think that the occupant of the White House was their representative. In appreciation, they showered him with gifts, a firkin of butter, a crate of Bartlett pears, New England salmon, and on and on. With a special appropriateness, a man from Johnsburg, New York, sent Lincoln a live American eagle, the bird of our land that he had caught. He'd caught it in a trap, alas, and it cost him 1 foot. But the New Yorker continued, "He is yet an eagle, and perhaps no more crippled than the nation whose banner he represents. His wings are sound, and they will extend to 7 feet." In part, common people rallied behind Abraham Lincoln because most Americans support their government in time of war. In part also, it was because by the beginning of 1862, it seemed that the Lincoln government was master of the situation. In the West, General Grant had captured Forts Henry and Donelson. had pushed through and taken most of Tennessee, and the Confederate West was in ruins. Farragut had pushed up the Mississippi and captured New Orleans. Union amphibious operations had established bases on the Sea Islands of South Carolina and on Cape Hatteras. And in the east, General George H.W. McClellan had organized and drilled the most commanding, the most powerful, and the most effective army that the American continent had ever seen. To suggest the unreasonableness of the request. For instance, when an officer accused of embezzling $40 of government funds appeared before Lincoln to protest that really he should not be punished because he had stolen only $30. Lincoln said he was reminded of an Indianian who got in a quarrel with his neighbor's daughter because he charged that she had behaved immorally and had 3 illegitimate children. Now, said the girl's father, enraged, that's a lie and I can prove it, for she has only 2. The man got the message. Lincoln's friends worried that he was confined to his office so much of the time. They urged him to get out and take fresh air and exercise, but the president insisted on seeing everybody who wanted to see him. They don't want much and they get very little, he said. I know how I would feel in their place. Remarkably, during Lincoln's first 12 months in office, this systematic lack of system seemed to work. Stories of his patience, his humanity, his accessibility to even the humblest petitioner spread throughout the North. Millions began to refer to him as Father Abraham. For the first time in American history, common people in the United States began to think that the occupant of the White House was their representative. In appreciation, they showered him with gifts, a firkin of butter, a crate of Bartlett pears, New England salmon, and on and on. With a special appropriateness, a man from Johnsburg, New York, sent Lincoln a live American eagle, the bird of our land that he had caught. He'd caught it in a trap, alas, and it cost him 1 foot. But the New Yorker continued, he is yet an eagle, and perhaps no more crippled than the nation whose banner he represents. His wings are sound, and they will extend to 7 feet. In part, common people rallied behind Abraham Lincoln because most Americans support their government in time of war. In part also, it was because by the beginning of 1862, it seemed that the Lincoln government was master of the situation. In the West, General Grant had captured Forts Henry and Donelson, had pushed through and taken most of Tennessee, and the Confederate West was in ruins. Farragut had pushed up the Mississippi and captured New Orleans. Union amphibious operations had established bases on the Sea Islands of South Carolina and on Cape Hatteras. And in the east, General George W. McClellan had organized and drilled the most commanding, the most powerful, and the most effective army that the American continent had ever seen. By early 1862, then, it's no surprise that Lincoln's mail was filled with letters like that from retired General Winfield Scott, rejoicing in the inevitable and early suppression of this great American rebellion. A jubilant Kentuckian reported that President Lincoln has the grandest opportunity of immortalizing himself in history as the restorer of his country, the second George Washington. Wily old politicians saw the handwriting on the wall, too. Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania wrote the president of the growing belief that you will have to be your own successor. While the White House is, in my judgment, said Cameron coyly, it is the last place to find happiness. I think you will have to make up your mind to endure it. Meanwhile, during these same 12 months, Mrs. Lincoln was achieving some victories of her own. Indeed, she became the most conspicuous occupant of the White House since Dolly Madison. Brought up to express an active interest in public affairs, deeply involved in her husband's political career, Mary Lincoln had no intention of fading into the background in Washington. She intended to become, and she became, the First Lady of the land, and that term was coined to describe Mrs. Lincoln. Mary Lincoln made it her main purpose, her main project, to refurbish the White House. Congress had appropriated $20,000 for the rehabilitation of the executive mansion over the 4 years of her husband's term of office. This was to her an immense amount of money, and indeed it was a sizable amount, worth, I would say at least 10 times that much in present-day purchasing power. It was more than 4 times the amount that the Lincoln total family income had reached in any year before 1860. To Mary, it seemed an infinite treasure. She could hardly wait to get on the train to go to New York and Philadelphia to order furnishings suitable for the mansion of the President of the United States and his First Lady. Merchants welcomed her with open arms, showing her the best and the most expensive carpeting, material for upholstery and drapes, furniture, and china. And she bought everything. Much of her effort went into refurbishing the family rooms upstairs and to making the living quarters homey and comfortable. She took special pains in the guest bedroom, repapering it with light purple wallpaper figured with gold roses. And for this room, she ordered the ornately carved 7-foot rosewood bed that is always referred to, and President Mrs. Bush just showed it to us, as the Lincoln bed, though in fact, of course, the president probably never slept on it. It was framed in the most elegant of canopies, made of purple silk, trimmed with gold lace, gathered at the headboard with a gold coronet. But most of Mary Lincoln's purchases were for the public rooms, these rooms downstairs. Receipted bills in the National Archives show that she purchased chairs, sofas, hassocks, fabrics of damask, brocade, pink tarlatan, plush, French satin delaine, wallpaper imported from France, a full set of Haviland china in Solferino and gold, with the American coat of arms in the center of each plate. For the Red Room, she ordered 117 yards of crimson Wilton carpet. For the East Room, an imported Brussels velvet carpet, pale green in color, ingeniously woven as a single piece, which, one admirer gushed, in effect looked as if the ocean in gleaming and transparent waves were tossing roses at your feet. Now, Mary sensed that in her few short weeks of shopping, she was exceeding her budget for 4 years. But the merchants told her there was nothing to worry about. After all, she's purchasing on credit, and the bills wouldn't come due for months. Anyway, she could not control herself. Her passion for shopping was already beginning to turn into a disease. Returning to Washington, she personally oversaw the scrubbing, painting, plastering of the entire White House, so that for the first time in years, the executive mansion was sparklingly clean. And as her new furnishings began to arrive, the whole place began to take on a look of elegance. Now, to modernize, Mary Lincoln's fondness for ornate laces, for heavy tasseled drapes, for plush overstuffed furniture seems at best quaint and at worst vulgar. But this was the height of the Victorian age, when less was certainly not more. Even critical observers praised her accomplishments. But then, inevitably, the bills began coming in. In December of 1861, she discovered she had exceeded the congressional appropriation by $6,700. Desperately, she sought to conceal her extravagance from her husband, arguing, alas, quite correctly, that such overruns are common in government, and that no doubt the deficit could be overcome with just a little budget juggling. Finally, she was obliged to ask the Commissioner of Public Buildings, who kept the White House accounts, to get the president to support a supplementary congressional appropriation. Lincoln was furious. He would never, he said, endorse such a deficiency appropriation. It would stink in the nostrils of the American people to have it said that the President of the United States had approved a bill overrunning an appropriation for $20,000 for flub-dubs for this damned old house, when our soldiers don't even have blankets in the field. Rather than ask Congress for more money, he said he would pay for it out of his own pocket. Eventually, though, he was obliged to come down off his high horse, and Congress quietly passed the deficiency appropriation to cover Mary's expenditures. And breathing a sigh of relief, with that obstacle overcome, Mrs. Lincoln was ready to celebrate her success, which was equal, she thought, to her husband's. And on February 5, 1862, she held a reception with admission limited to 500 invited guests. Carriages began to arrive in the North Portico at about 9 o'clock with besorded, over-decorated diplomats, generals in bright uniforms, members of the cabinet, the Supreme Court, and selected congressmen and senators. In the East Room, they were greeted by the president, who was wearing a new black swallowtail coat that looked as if it needed pressing, and the First Lady, whose loamy white silk dress, decorated with hundreds of small black flowers, exposed a remarkably low décolletage. In the background, the Marine Band played. its repertoire including a sprightly new piece, the Mary Lincoln Polka. And at midnight, the doors to the dining room were opened to expose a magnificent buffet concocted by Maillards of New York, which displayed sugary models of the Ship of State, Fort Sumter, Fort Pickens, flanked by mounds of turkey, duck, ham, terrapin, pheasant. Dinner was served until 3, and many guests stayed on until daybreak. Altogether, concluded the Washington Star, the reception was the most superb thing of its kind ever seen in this city. That February 1862 party marked a turning point in the Lincolns' life in the White House. Even while the visitors downstairs were celebrating Mary Lincoln's success in refurbishing the executive mansion and her husband's prospective success over the Confederacy, upstairs, 2 small Lincoln boys were desperately ill. Bilious fever, it was called, probably typhoid fever from pollution of the White House water system. Deeply anxious, their parents had considered canceling the grand reception, but the family doctor assured them that the boys were in no immediate danger. Even so, several times during the party, both the president and his wife slipped quietly upstairs to their son's bedside. During the next 2 weeks, Tad continued to improve, though he was still very ill, but Willie grew worse and worse. On Thursday, February 20, he died. Both parents were prostrated with grief. Lincoln loved this little boy, a bright, intelligent little boy, probably more than any of his other children, and he found it difficult to accept his loss. For several consecutive Thursdays, the memory of Willie's death was so oppressive that in silent, solitary grief, he shut himself up in the guest room where the little boy had died. Though he had to go through the motions of continuing the business of the presidency, his heart was not in it. Only slowly did he come to identify the loss of Willie with that of so many other young Americans who were dying from disease and battle, and his private grief became the source of an even greater resolution to preserve the Union. But his wife could not so sublimate her grief. Having earlier lost a favorite son, Eddie, in Springfield, Mary Lincoln could not deal with this second loss. And for 3 weeks, she took to her bed in grief so desolated that she could not attend the funeral nor look after Tad, who was slowly beginning to recover. For many months, the mere mention of Willie's name was enough to send Mary Lincoln into paroxysms of weeping. It was necessary for Lincoln to employ a resident nurse to look after her. Never again did Mary Lincoln enter the guest room where the little boy had died, nor the green room downstairs where his body had been embalmed. When finally able to emerge from her room, Mary Lincoln went into such profound mourning dress that she was almost invisible under layers of black crape and veils. In these circumstances, of course, all social life at the White House ceased, and the executive mansion was heavily draped in black. Grieving over the death of her son, Mary Lincoln gave little further thought to the mansion that she spent so much time in refurbishing, and in the months following Willie's death, while the public rooms were largely unattended and unoccupied, an enormous amount of vandalism occurred, and the press, with characteristic partisanship, blamed that on Mrs. Lincoln and said that she was stealing from the White House. Such material concerns were, however, of little interest to Mary Lincoln by this time, who was convinced in some obscure way that her extravagant purchases and her ostentatious display had caused her son's death. Bitterly blaming herself, she sought to reach out to Willie beyond the grave. Presently, she became the victim of spiritualists who claimed they could put her in touch with the dead, darling, lost boy. Often she went to a medium's darkened quarters in Georgetown, but on at least 8 occasions, seances were held right here in the White House. The president himself attended one, not out of any belief in spiritualism, but to find who was preying on his wife's mental instability. Though, as a matter of fact, it would have been hard to blame Abraham Lincoln if he too had looked for supernatural help from any quarter at this time. For by mid-1862, it was clear that the anticipated Union victory in the Civil War was not coming about. In the Western Theater, after the bloody Battle of Shiloh, Union armies stalled. In the East, the Army of the Potomac got within sight of Richmond, and then, because of the ineptitude of its commander, McClellan, it retreated in defeat. With his grand strategy crumbling, Lincoln desperately sought new commanders who could bring quick victories. And in a game of military musical chairs, John Pope was appointed to high command, and the result was the Second Battle of Bull Run. Then there followed Ambrose Burnside, who led to the fiasco at Fredericksburg, and boasting Joseph Hooker, who brought about the rout at Chancellorsville. With these military defeats came political rebuffs. Invoking military necessity, Lincoln, in the fall of '62, issued his Emancipation Proclamation. It probably did not of itself free a single slave, but it almost certainly did result in the defeat of his party in the congressional elections that fall. So mistrusted was Lincoln that in December 1862, a caucus of the leaders of his own party in the Senate urged him to fire his Secretary of State, reconstruct his whole cabinet, and put somebody else in charge. In this time of trouble, the president applied himself to the duties of his office with a grim intensity that helped distract his attention from his personal woes. Rising very early, after a generally sleepless night, Lincoln went at once to his desk, where he worked for an hour or so before breakfast, which consisted of a cup of coffee and an egg. He returned to the office then to sign papers and examine commissions for another hour or so until 10 o'clock, when the doors were opened to the public for petitioners. At 1 o'clock, unless he forgot about it, he took a brief break for lunch with Mary and Tad and occasionally a close personal family friend. Abstemious as always, Lincoln customarily had an apple and a glass of milk for lunch. Then he went back to the office, where he remained for the rest of the afternoon, unless somebody could persuade him to go for a horseback or carriage ride. Having no interest in food, he ate a Spartan dinner with no alcohol, and unless there was some ceremony or reception, he again went back to his desk after supper. Late at night, he would often walk through the White House grounds to the War Department to read the latest telegraphic dispatches from the armies. Only then, if there was no major fighting underway, did he feel he could relax for a few minutes with his family. I consider myself fortunate, Mary Lincoln wrote at this time, if at 11 o'clock I once more find myself in my pleasant room, and very especially if my weary and tired husband is there waiting to receive me. Inevitably, with such a schedule, President and Mrs. Lincoln began to drift apart. For some time, the Lincolns had slept in separate bedrooms, as I have mentioned. Now, after the death of Willie, Tad, who was subject to nightmares and couldn't sleep at all, he was so desperately lonely, he was allowed regularly to sleep in his father's bed. Mary Lincoln was totally absorbed in her own affairs and in her grief. Lincoln was, of course, aware of his wife's unstable condition, but nobody knew how to treat such mental illness in those days. In any case, he was desperately exhausted. Always thin, he lost so much weight as now to look positively cadaverous. Though worn out, fortunately, he was able to maintain his sense of humor about his appearance. When somebody told him, "Mr. President, you look terrible, you look as thin as a shad," he responded in what is undoubtedly the worst pun he ever made. "You should say, I look even worse, I look thin as a shadder." Which is terrible, isn't it? Great black circles ringed his eyes. Chronically weary, he was never able to get any rest. As he expressed it, the little relaxation he allowed himself seemed never to reach the tired spot. Coming to regard the White House as a prison, both the Lincolns welcomed the opportunity to escape during the summer months to a cottage on the grounds of the Soldiers' Home, 3 miles to the north of Washington. But of course, presidential duties continued, and Lincoln had to ride back and forth to his office every day, nor did Mary Lincoln's anxieties abate. She was often in a state of near hysteria concerning her husband's safety, and with justice, since on one occasion, some would-be assassin or maybe an overzealous soldier did actually puncture the president's hat with a bullet. She was also worried because her oldest son, Robert, now about to graduate from Harvard, wanted to enlist in the Union Army. He had the tacit approval of his father, but she obdurately opposed it. She had, she said, already sacrificed one son to the Union. She could not spare another. A year after Willie's death, Mary Lincoln emerged from full mourning, and an endless round of White House receptions and soirees began again. Hardly a week passed without one or two state dinners at the White House for the diplomatic corps, for visiting foreign dignitaries, for congressmen, and so on. And in addition, every week there were 2 evening receptions, one on Tuesday and one on Saturday. A reception, a contemporary journalist explained, consists in throwing open the presidential mansion to everyone, high or low, gentle or ungentle, washed or unwashed, who chooses to go. And the net result is always a promiscuous, horrible jam. At 8 o'clock, the doors were opened and people were admitted to the north portico. They crossed the broad corridor to the Red Room, and there Nicolay introduced them to the president, who shook each guest's hand, even though by the end of one of these evenings, after shaking hands with thousands of people, he often had blisters between his fingers. They were then presented to Mrs. Lincoln. She was saved from having to shake hands because of her hoop skirts, which made it impossible for anybody to get closer than 3 feet, so you couldn't shake hands with her. They were next shepherded through the green room into the great East Room, where they stood about and talked. No drink and no food was served. At 10 o'clock, the president, with Mrs. Lincoln on his arm, entered, made a circuit of the room, the Marine Band played Hail Columbia, and the party was over. These social affairs, dreary as they sound, were exhausting to the tired president and his distraught wife, and they probably did very little to increase his approval rating at all. Bored and depressed, the president was not at his best on these occasions, and often it was clear his mind and his heart were not in it. After one of them, Richard Henry Dana, Jr., reported, in a characteristic tone of New England superiority, that he'd attended one of these receptions and that Mrs. Lincoln looks like the housekeeper of the establishment, and a notable prying and not good-tempered housekeeper either. While, he said, Abe looks like a man who's brought in something to sell. Aware of these criticisms, both the Lincolns believed that these social functions were necessary to maintain morale in time of war. Anyway, the president claimed that he learned something from the thousands of visitors who shook his hand. They gave him a public opinion bath that was better than any reading of newspapers. By this time, though, Mary Lincoln's performance at these occasions was more or less perfunctory. Her attention to social affairs began to dwindle. She began to do a great deal of fairly aimless traveling, usually accompanied by Tad. There were trips to New York, to Long Branch, New Jersey, to Boston when Robert was there, to the White Mountains. And everywhere Mary went, she gratified her passion for shopping. Once directed toward refitting the White House, it was now indulged in to outfit her person. She could not check her desire to purchase. She had to have a $1,500 cashmere shawl. About $15,000 in present-day purchasing power. She needed new dresses. She needed specially made hats. She needed diamonds. She needed pearls. She needed gloves. Indeed, it is said that she bought 400 pairs of gloves in a 3-month period. Her passion for material possessions had now become boundless. When the Lincoln family, just 3 people, the Lincoln family moved out to the Soldiers' Home for the summer of 1863, Mary Lincoln required a train of 19 wagons to carry out her clothes and supplies. She was not by this point entirely rational, poor lady. There was a kind of logic, though, a circular logic to be sure, behind her obsessive concern for clothing. She knew she was accumulating huge debts. But I must dress it costly material, she explained to a friend. The people scrutinize every article I wear with critical curiosity. A failure to dress in proper style would cause people to vote against her husband and result in his defeat in the next presidential election of 1864. Now, if he's elected, she went on, I can keep him in ignorance of my affairs. But if he's defeated, then the bills will come and be sent to him. In other words, Mary Lincoln had to continue buying more in order to keep her husband from knowing what she had already bought. Now, proud of his wife's handsome appearance, it is certain Lincoln never thought of her dresses as being a factor in his re-election. Much more important in his mind was the continued failure of Union armies. After mid-1863 successes at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, there were no further advances. The following year, Grant, brought east to be commander-in-chief, led a series of direct assaults on the Confederates and got again within sight of Richmond, about as close as McClellan had done before, 2 years earlier, and nothing happened. War weariness among citizens, desertion among soldiers were rampant. And in 1864, the Democrats nominated George McClellan for president on a peace platform. So dispiriting was the outlook that Lincoln glumly predicted his own defeat. And then the tide turned. General Sherman's capture of Atlanta came just in time to cheer Union supporters, and Lincoln was reelected, though by a very narrow majority. Shortly afterward, as Sherman cut a swath of devastation through Georgia and Grant gained a stranglehold on Richmond, it became clear that the Confederacy was doomed. And night after night, the White House was illuminated to celebrate Union victories, and crowds gathered on the North Lawn to serenade the president, who came out of the small room on the second floor looking out over the North Lawn to give a few words about the meaning of the victory that Union armies were achieving. Life in the White House during these final weeks of the conflict achieved a tranquility that the Lincolns had not known in their 4 years of occupancy. With all decisions made, with the armies admirably commanded, the president no longer had to feel personally responsible for every action or to sit up nights waiting in the telegraph room of the War Department for news of the latest disaster. As the end of the war approached, both Lincolns felt they were awakening from what Mary called this hideous nightmare through which they had been living. It is from this period that we have the loveliest of the portraits of Lincoln, including the president's own favorite portrait, the Peacemakers, upstairs. They show a face that is saddened, that is serene, and that is superbly confident. He has come through, he has achieved victory. On Friday, April 14, 1865, President Lincoln seemed particularly happy. Dear husband, Mary remarked, "You almost startled me by your cheerfulness." That afternoon, they took a carriage ride, and the president, cheerful, even playful, talked of happier times ahead of them. "Mary," he said, "I consider this day the war has come to a close. We must both be more cheerful in the future. Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable." By the time they returned to the White House, Mary was beginning to have one of her headaches, and she thought of staying at home for the evening. But Lincoln's mind was fixed on having some relaxation. Anyway, he had already given his word that he would appear in the presidential box at the popular Ford's Theater. So Mary got up and put on a pretty bonnet and a small patterned blue dress. Lincoln got ready in a characteristic man's fashion by brushing his hair with his hand and picking up his silk hat. Arm in arm, they went to the north door of the White House and left it for the last time together.
Now to wait 1 second till we get the professor who has brightened our lives down to the other end of the hall, and then if you'd wander on through and say hello, and we have some refreshments down there, and I know we'd all like to shake his hand and tell him what a special evening this has been for the White House. Come.